This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Welcome. Today I'm joined by Michael Colvard. Michael, welcome. Thank you for being on the program.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. So, Michael, where are you ministering now? And I guess, how did you get to the Reformed faith and the PCA? And then you can tell us where you're currently serving.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm at Harbor Church PCA in Mooresville, North Carolina. We're 30 to 40 minutes north of Charlotte. So this is it's a suburban context, but what's really neat about Mooresville is Lowe's Hardware, their corporate headquarters, is located in Mooresville. So we have quite a melting pot, even though we're in the suburbs of North Carolina. Yeah, how did I come to the Reformed faith? Well, I originally was baptized in a liberal PCUSA church up in Cleveland, Ohio.
Oh.
Moved down to Asheville, North Carolina. I was in grade school. We actually went to a PCA church, but to be honest, my family were Easter, Christmas Christians for a while, and also too, I don't mean this to demean any of the. I'm sure the ladies who were doing Sunday school were doing an excellent job, but I was a precocious youth, and I was hearing stuff in the school that I went to about evolution and science, how the Big Bang Theory disproved God's existence, all those sorts of things. And on the other hand, I was hearing a lot of, at least to me, well, we just have to have faith. We just need to believe or trust. And so for me, after the pastor of that church had a moral failing, I was out. So I lived my life outside of Christ for a number of years. Freshman year of college, I went to Wake Forest University. I was on spring break, and I was converted with the most unlikely of C.S. Lewis books. Everybody points to Mere Christianity. Mine was The Great Divorce, which is a completely unorthodox book in terms of its theology. But I do believe, and this is really what convinced me of Reformed theology later on, was that it was God calling on me to show me how very little I truly understood about myself, about the world, about my place in it. And so it was really just a conviction of the heart that I saw. I needed, somehow I just knew I needed Christ. I stumbled my way into a PCA church in Asheville, not knowing it was PCA. I then stumbled my way into RUF back at Wake Forest. It's a bit of a funny story, but I actually, at the time, again, baby Christian, I was starting to date a non-Christian, but her roommate was a Christian and dragged her to RUF, so dragged me to RUF. And that's really where I fell in love with the Reformed faith. Here were some solid answers that I was not getting as a youth. Does that answer your question, I think?
Yes. You say that you're from Ohio.
Yeah.
But what would you say to people who don't believe that Ohio exists?
Ohio is the heart of America, Ryan. It's the heart of America. I like to say that, especially now, granted, I will say there is a difference between Cleveland and the rest of Ohio. Cleveland has a chip on its shoulder that makes it feel like an East Coast town. That it's not the same thing as those folks in Cincinnati or Columbus. So,
well, yeah. And Cleveland's had a chip on its shoulder since I think the Cuyahoga River caught on fire.
Pretty much. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
But now, a few of our listeners or viewers they're Ohio skeptic. So we just like to make sure that we reach the Ohio skeptic demographic. Someday we'll have JD Vance on, and he can set the record straight, I suppose.
Yes.
But so our topic today is the assistant pastor, not the assistant to the pastor,
right.
But the assistant pastor. And as I read some of your work, it sounds like the confusion about that is real. What is this, an assistant pastor? Is this an assistant to the pastor? So
right.
In the PCA, can you explain what is an assistant pastor and how is he different from a pastor or an associate pastor?
Great question. Yeah, the basic idea, and this is something that for me, this question has gone all the way back to when I was studying for ordination. And any pastor that you have, a head pastor or an associate pastor, is called by the congregation. So that means that you have to have a search committee, and they'll recommend a man. Then the congregation is going to come together. They're going to vote whether to call that man to be the pastor or not. And so we generally call that consent, right? And this goes back to, there's an early principle back in 1788. The preliminary principles of the Presbyterian Church in America. One of those, preliminary principle 6, talks about how the power to the congregation has the power to elect those who have exercise within the church. And so that's generally most of your pastors that you have, that's true of. But in the PCA, we have this, albeit, at least in my opinion, somewhat strange category of an assistant pastor. An assistant pastor is called not by the congregation, but by the session. And so the congregation never weighs in on that particular man. And so before I don't want to get ahead of myself. So I think that answers your general question about what do we do in the PCA, right? And so the question is, if a man is pastoring in the church, but he hasn't been called by the congregation, by what basis may he or might he not have authority within the church?
Yeah, and that is the question of the hour. But to summarize, so an associate pastor or a pastor, those are men who have been called by the congregation. They've been approved by presbytery, and hands have been laid on them. They've been ordained. Now, an assistant pastor is someone the session has essentially hired and is approved by presbytery, and hands are laid on him. And so we don't have unordained pastors in the PCA.
Correct.
That's something that people will be confused about. Well, our youth pastor, well, what do you mean youth pastor? Is he ordained? No, he's just then he's not a pastor. But,
yeah. That gets a little confusing too, because I did serve at a church plant north of Baltimore for a little bit as an assistant to the pastor, which really it's an assistant, and then we just throw to the pastor in just to make it seem a little more official. But I was an assistant. I was unordained. Yeah. And I heard so many office jokes because of it too.
Yes. And of course the old, the difference between an assistant and an associate pastor is about $10,000. And the difference between an assistant to and the associate is about $20,000, I would guess. But
something like that.
Ecclesiology aside. So the first time assistant pastor or pastor's assistant appears in American Presbyterianism is in the late 19th century, as I gather from your work, something of a temporary, maybe even a part-time position.
Yeah, so it does go back. There's a man by the name of J. Aspinwall Hodge. So he's a nephew of Charles Hodge. He's a little more famous of the two. And he wrote this wonderful book talking about sort of the history of Presbyterian church polity. It's written almost as a catechism, which is, at least I find, very easy to read. And he notes that there was a practice in the old Scottish kirk, so prior to the founding of America, where there were pastors, apostrophe S, pastor's assistant.
Singular possessive, huh?
Yeah, that's right. I've not done enough study on that end of things, but the way that he describes what was going on in the 1880s, that's when he's writing it, is that there were pastor's assistants or assistant pastors, and it's this kind of nebulous definition. So he says, well, some assistant pastors are ordained, and some pastor's assistants are not ordained, and some are called the same thing. So in other words, for what he describes happening in the 1880s is more about the function of what that man is doing. He is functioning as assisting the head pastor. Whether he's ordained or not, to a certain extent, doesn't matter, which is a little different from the way that we might think of an assistant pastor. I almost think of it as like Alexander Hamilton served as an aide-de-camp to Washington. So he's writing letters for Washington. He's organizing stuff. Perhaps there would be something like that. Maybe the pastor wants him to run a Sunday school class or something like that in late 1800s. So it's this really nebulous thing that's going on. And all this time, not until 1945, do we have any official Book of Church Order definition of what the assistant pastor is.
Hmm.
Even though, weirdly enough, if you go back to the General Assembly minutes of the Southern PCUS, they used the title assistant pastor in their roles. So they're using the titles, but there's no definition for that whatsoever.
That doesn't help when you have when you don't define your terms.
It's really confusing. Yeah. And I know other guys have done some work on this, but I thought it was fascinating as I was doing my research. In 1918, the Presbytery of Brazos, which I assume is probably in Texas, they answered a question. They proposed a question to the General Assembly questioning whether we should use the title of assistant pastor at all. And the General Assembly said, well, it's not mentioned in our books, but it's not forbidden. Well, that's not helpful. Yeah.
You would have thought the first part of that answer would have answered the question. It's not mentioned in our books, so
if don't use it. Yeah, or something like that. Yeah.
So is the PCA the only denomination in the Reformed Communion currently that has assistant pastors?
Most of NAPARC, and if I think some of your audience is probably familiar with the term NAPARC, these are churches that we have fraternal orders with. We're really the outlier among those groups, as far as I'm aware. I do know that the EPC has one, but theirs has a definite time period attached to it. ECO, I think, has one as well, but they can actually, the congregation can vote to give them a place on the session. So you can actually have an assistant pastor who has a place on the session.
So, okay.
Yeah. And then the PCUSA, they got rid of that in I think 83. I have a family member who was a ruling elder in the PCUSA for decades. And so he remembers that particular vote. It really didn't have to do so much with the polity as much as it had to do with, they don't allow their associates to succeed the head pastor at all. So in the PCA, we allow for associates or assistants to succeed the head pastor with certain extra voting thresholds. But in the PCUSA, not allowed at all.
Wow.
But people were getting around that by an older pastor grooming an assistant pastor, and then assistant pastor could succeed him. So they closed the loophole and just cut the position out entirely.
Interesting. It seems, I think, based on a conversation I had with a former professor, that the assistant pastor in the PCA used to be, I think it came in through the RPCES, and it was really a temporary position, and it was sort of you do it for a year or two, it's kind of like residency. And then if you're in your third year of an assistant pastor, you really may need to consider a career in something else.
And that's definitely, even historically, J. Aspinwall Hodge talks about how an assistant pastor could be a probationary sort of role. So I think the sense I think that I was getting from him is that more than likely this would be the kind of thing where a man might serve for a temporary time period. Yeah. And then once he gets his feet underneath him, he feels comfortable ministering, he'd take a pastorate somewhere else, or become an associate. Yeah. And
I know we're getting kind of ahead of ourselves, but I think there are a number of churches, at least in my presbytery, that practice that they'll call them in as assistant pastors, but then invariably after 2 or 3 years, the congregation will extend a call to those men as associate pastors. It's almost predictable. And I think that's a wise way to use that pastoral relation, but we can talk more about that later. But so the Southern Church really is where I think this idea came about in the early 1900s, the early 20th century, and they were trying to put time limits on pastoral tenures. It sounded similar to a Methodist situation. Can you elaborate on that? How did that have anything to do with assistant pastors?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just go back a little bit further, because I think it's helpful to understand the pressures and the situations that were going on during the Southern PCUS. And the reason why we're focusing on the Southern PCUS is that was the forebear to the PCA, right? So a lot of our
Presbyterianism came from, right?
Yes. So there was a lot of work in the early 20th century with reevaluating, renewing, and editing the Book of Church Order as it currently stood. So in the 1920s, early 1920s, they were reworking entire chapters on calling and pastoral relations. It struck me as, I don't know if you feel this way, but, in the PCA, a General Assembly, you usually haggle over, we're changing one sentence. And sometimes people think that's too much. Well, these guys were like, no, let's just change 2 or 3 chapters. We'll do it in 2 or 3 years. Another thing that was going on that maybe different from how the PCA typically works is the structure of the church was way more complicated. So you had odd interim. If you're not familiar with that term, odd interim means in the middle. So they weren't meeting. They were meeting in between when General Assembly is meeting. They were using these odd interim committees for years. They would meet for years to discuss various things, and anything from there was lots of discussion from an odd interim committee on prohibition. Should we excommunicate members of our church who produce alcohol? Right? They had an odd interim committee that met for several years in a row to talk about that. There's an odd interim committee on Bible translation. There's an odd interim committee on Sabbath observance. And so that is one thing that's a little different. We're used to, if there's a study committee, it goes for like a year or two and then it's done. But these things were going on for years. And so in the 1930s, particularly like 34 through 36, there were 2 different odd interim committees. One started and they felt like they needed more people on it, so they added on to it. And these were, one of the odd interim titles was to determine the terms of service for a definite period of time. So I agree with you. I don't have any evidence for this, but I suspect that the Presbyterians were looking over their shoulder with envy at this point in time at how much the Methodist Church was growing, and the Baptist Church too, I should say. But they looked towards the Methodist Church, I think, and they were saying, they have something going here by moving pastors around from church to church. And so they were actually looking to put a definite period of time on every pastoral call. So even head pastors and associate pastors, they were called for 5 years. After 5 years, they would be immediately terminated. These were the sorts of ideas that were being batted around in these odd interim committees. And so you've got a large substructure here. You've got you have a climate within Presbyterianism, at least in that odd interim committee. Now, maybe you'll find in other churches this not to be the case, but in that odd interim committees, they wanted presbytery to take a more quote unquote, and this is quoting from the committee report, an Episcopalian function that would compel churches to more necessary changes. And I think, you're coming out of, again, you got World War I has just happened, right? And you've got this, we're going to have this one world government where we can solve problems through legislation and government structures. They didn't live in the era of Doge, right? And so,
right. And the Federal Council of Churches and all of the
right
amalgam.
Yeah, bureaucracy. Yeah. This is the heyday of bureaucracy, right? And so I think to them, they were thinking, we need to, if we're going to really grow and fix stuff, we got to have more power at the top, which again is very alien to the way the PCA works today. And then you throw in the Great Depression. So now, while we're technically getting out of the Great Depression at this time in the 34 or 36, but I think as we all know, the church always lags about 10 years behind the rest of the rest of the world. I can still remember I graduated from Covenant Seminary in 2009. And 2008, 2009 was a housing crisis. And still, like 2010, 2011, it was really hard to find open pastoral positions.
People were not moving.
People weren't moving. Yeah, and I think that's really what was happening at that time period. The Odd Interim Committee says we have what they call churchless pastors and pastorless churches. So what they were seeing is there were still a lot of men who were going to seminary and wanting to get ordained. So you had a steady influx. But then because churches couldn't pay a lot because of the Great Depression. And people wanted stability. A lot of guys were just staying to the large urban churches that were financially stable, and the country churches couldn't pay enough. In fact, this is a time period where you might have one pastor who was serving in multiple congregations because they just couldn't afford it. And so they're looking at this problem and they say, you know what we need to do? We need to break up
Trustbusters, huh?
Yeah, sorry. yeah, that's right. Yeah, we got to plow the field, and so we got to figure out ways to start moving pastors out of these churches to make way for new blood. And so they try to do this a couple of ways. Number one, they tried to do this. They tried to break that up by creating a retirement annuity for older pastors, because again, we're at this point, I mean, Social Security at that point was still voluntary as opposed to today. So you had very little, some of these older pastors would have probably retired earlier, but they had no safety net. So let's set them up with a retirement account. This is also the origin of commissions within presbytery of the minister and his work. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, at least my interactions with folks who have been in the PCUSA, this is a mainstay of that particular denomination. And this would have been commissions. They could do the work. They would be representatives from presbytery that could go into your churches and they could advise you and even put some pressure on you to start changing certain things. To give you an example of what that looks like today in a PCUSA church, let's say your pastor leaves, it would be the minister and his work committee who would come and meet with your session and give you a list of various people they think would be really good for you as a church, right? So in other words, it's a very bureaucratic, top-down sort of system they were putting in place. And then we come to the assistant pastor, right? The assistant pastor was originally was really proposed by Wilmington Presbytery. Oh, good, you got that up there. Yeah, and Wilmington. This would be 1936. Wilmington proposes, at least as far as I'm aware, the first time that you have an assistant pastor who is specifically defined as an ordained man who is employed by the session. It does not say in either the interim recommendation or the overture on whether this is short term or not, but in the context of everything that they were talking about at the time, this is a way to get a pastor who would be hired by the session, fired by the session, and you didn't have to go through the muss and fuss of having a congregational meeting.
So, those are time consuming.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, and there's a lot of heartache. You know, the congregation might really like the guy, but you know they don't know as much as us session members. I think that was sort of the idea behind it. So it fits within that context of if the session knows better than the congregation, then they can move on from the guy quicker than the congregation can.
Certainly, and especially with a subordinate, sort of a junior pastor, but when it's the only pastor, that becomes problematic, and I would think would create more tension between, or even mistrust between the people and the elders. Initially, assistant pastors were not installed. Why was that the case?
Yeah, I thought that was so fascinating. So the original proposal, they said no, at least from the Ad Interim Committee, they said there should be no formal installation necessary. So you had to get approved by Presbytery, but no installation. And I think the reason for that was that they recognized that there was going to be a bit of a trouble with preliminary principle number 6, because you don't have the congregation calling them, and they're not really being installed at that church having authority in that church. So I think that's them wrestling with, we want to be compliant with the preliminary principles, but how do we do that? And the PCA has gone a different route in that what we've done is we just changed the vows, right? So that you say all the vows except for the church doesn't have to submit to that pastor's authority.
Which I suppose that is one way of answering that.
Yep. Yeah. I think it just highlights just how difficult and sticky the situation is, because you're an ordained pastor, which I think at some gut level, even if we could set aside all the technical stuff, at a gut level, we just recognize the guy is ordained a pastor. He's got authority. But how is it that he can have authority within the church without having consent, right? And so I think that just sort of highlights those differences. It highlights the real stickiness of this. Is why it continues to be a conversation.
Yes, and assistant pastors, I wonder if they're more common in the PCA than they were in the PCUS in the early 20th century, and maybe that was the reason for the lack of installation. If it was assumed to be a short tenure, and there was the issue with principles. So then, do you see that the pastoral relation of assistant pastor is more than a principled part of our polity? You mentioned in your article, let me see if I can pull it up here.
Yeah.
The text shows us that the proposal for a session called assistant pastors came at a time when the PCUS prioritized practicality, centralization.
Right. Yes. I have to give a shout out to my lovely wife, Lindsay, because she did a great job of helping me to edit, because I got into like college seminary writing mode for a little bit there.
Here's research.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I guess here's what I would say is that it's something that they said. The Ad Interim Committee talked about how we're sure that the church will accept all these proposals that we're coming up with, as long as we promise that they don't violate any preliminary principles of Presbyterian polity. And the sense that I got from that particular sentence in the report was, it was almost like, perhaps your audience is familiar with the distinction between like a normative view of worship versus a regulative view of worship, right?
Indeed.
So in a regulative view of worship, we would say, God says we shouldn't do something, don't do that. God says we should do something, do that. Well, what about what God is silent on? Well, regular principles say, don't do that, right? It's very simplified. In other words, I think it's a very principle-driven view of worship. We shouldn't start inventing new stuff just because we think it might be a good idea. The normative principle for worship would say, well, yeah, if the Bible doesn't say anything about it, well, yeah, kind of, be a little creative. And I get, that's kind of the sense I get from the Ad Interim Committee's view of church polity. It's sort of like, well, we see these problems, we want to fix them. Well, as long as we don't technically violate the law, we should be able to do whatever we want. Because as long as we're solving problems, people will thank us for it.
Yeah.
And so that's what I thought. I saw it as almost like, well, as long as we're compliant, we're fine. Versus actually asking, what do the principles drive us to do?
And that makes perfect sense, from their perspective. Especially, you referenced that that deliverance from the General Assembly. So you said placing the call of the assistant pastor in the hands of the session without consent reflects that pattern of centralization, or consistent application of the grassroots nature of the PCA have on assistant. So, do you see the pastoral relation assistant pastor as inconsistent with the grassroots nature of the PCA?
I think it brings up significant enough questions. I think that there are a lot of different ways historically that consent has been proposed.
Yeah.
Hodge talks about consent as potentially, actually, Hodge mentions later on in his book about ways in which pastors, and he doesn't distinguish assistant pastors, any pastor, he says, well, you could be directly voted on by the congregation, or he says the session could, or he calls it by committee, election by committee, that a man could be elected by a committee, and then the congregation gives consent by basically having, they have veto power. So they would accept the recommendation of the committee unless they really have a problem with it. Otherwise they give a veto. And I think even that gives at least the church some amount of consent, I guess. But I do find that I understand just point of fact, our church has an assistant pastor. Now we're working on making him not an assistant pastor. I'm not sure I'm absolutely opposed to the use of assistant pastor, but I do think you have to build in somehow, some way, I think at the front end as well as at the back end, some form of consent from the church, even if it's a veto power.
Yeah. Yeah, and I share your. I think I share your perspective that I'm not opposed entirely to that a pastoral relation of assistant pastor, but I do think it's overused. And when guys have been assistant pastors for decades, I think, and maybe we can talk about this later. I think it's demeaning to the man. What about this? Let me ask you: do you think it's consistent with our polity that men who have not been called by sessions or called by congregations are able to vote in the broader courts of the church at Presbyterian General Assembly, because they're then exercising authority?
Yeah, I mean that's the other trick. That's the other trick too that I definitely struggle with. I think if you can get consent from the church, I think that in some ways clarifies things with the higher courts. But I do think that, I mean, when we're talking about presbytery is the representation of the churches at the regional level, right? So I do think that there is at least some amount of, there's some odds, I think, with having somebody who's an assistant who's has not had any consent of the church other than the session, then representing the church at the higher courts level. So I can definitely see that. I don't think that it's, but again, going back to what we just said, I think it can be easily solved by giving the church some form of consent. Yeah.
And if we believe that church power is exercised to the members, but then through the officers, there is some sort of consent that these elders have been voted on by the congregation. They've been called by the congregation to exercise that authority, and they're calling a man to the assistant pastorate. Well, and then there's always the option that you can be faithful to your vows and still move to another congregation. Going back to the historical, how did or why did they want to make these calls more temporary? Was it simply because there were pastorless churches and churchless pastors? It seems like at least 100 years or 90 years later.
Yeah, I think that was a bit of the irony of some of my research was today we might say there's a big problem with men leaving their churches too quickly, right? Not staying over the long term. I think one of the joys that I've had as a pastor now, I've been the head pastor at this church 9 years, but I've actually been at the church for about 13. It's just watching the lifespan of the church, right, as you've been ministering there. But for them, I think it goes back to that bottleneck that they were trying to solve. And so we're churning out all these new seminarians who are graduating. They got to have a place somewhere. None of them want to go to the country churches. It is funny to me that in everything that I read of this odd interim committee, none of them ever talked about how can we lure these men to the country. So it was part, I think, of their idea to, we've got to somehow give these guys the ability to get ordained, and perhaps put them in a position where they can be easily moved on to another church or moved on to another role or something like that. And so assistant pastor was that niche of being able to, we can still ordain a guy, but the session is going to be much more willing to bring in an assistant for a while, and then he's going to find another church somewhere else and we'll bring in another assistant. That's a much easier thing to do than having a search committee where you have to cull from the congregation, and then we're going to have to, have several candidates, and then we're going to vote on it as a congregation, and then when you got to let them go, you got to call the congregation. I think it streamlines the process in order to make some of these pastoral roles that were so desired to be more fungible, I guess you could probably say.
Yeah, and if you call him as an assistant pastor, the congregation doesn't have to vote on his compensation.
Right.
If it's easy in, easy out, it's can be done. You can hire and fire
Right.
in 2 session meetings.
Right.
So what caution then do you have regarding, or would you suggest that churches exercise regarding assistant pastor?
Yeah. So I would say, let me back up and just talk about the man himself, right? I think that, my opinion at least, we should be thinking of assistant pastor roles as provisional. And so I think if we can at least change our perception of that, not just as, well, the youth guy always has to be an assistant pastor, because I think that's kind of the default, right? Or again, like you said, the older pastor who they're in their kind of retirement phase or sunsetting a little bit, but they still, have gifts to serve the church with. I think if we can change our viewpoint on that just a little bit, to be thinking about how can we best serve this man to be in a place where he is representing the church on the session, and that's actually the positive good that we're going for, that serves the man, and it also serves the congregation as well, and that's the most consistent with not just Presbyterian church polity, but I think it's consistent with biblical polity. I sometimes run into folks, good-natured folks, who they tend to think that, well, all this stuff is just rules and rules and rules. That gets in the way of ministry. Yeah, like, no, this is coming out of biblical principles. Yeah. So I guess that would be my caution, and I think that it does. I think there's the potential. How about I'll put it that way. I think there's a potential of the danger of having an assistant pastor long term whom the congregation has never called. It puts him in an awkward position because he has, I think he has practical authority. I mean, again, so many biblical polity issues could be solved if we just ask grandma in the congregation, right? What does grandma think? Right? At the end of the day, when grandma sees, Pastor Tyler, she does not make the distinction between, is he an assistant pastor or is he a associate pastor? She doesn't care. It's pastor, right? So he has authority. So if that's true, we need to make sure that his role fits with that practically. So I think there is a potential danger there, and it puts him in a position where, do I have the authority to speak into this right now? Because I'm not a real pastor. I'm an assistant pastor. I'm not saying he isn't, but you understand I think the practical side to that.
But they haven't called, so do I just need to sit back?
Right. How about preaching? Right. Yeah. We are to preach the word, and sometimes that means we are going to have to preach something as hard for the congregation to hear. It's what God's word says. But you're an assistant pastor, so they haven't asked you to do that, but you are preaching, so you have to do it. You're required by Christ to preach the word faithfully. So, if your church is a gossiping church and you come across a text that says don't gossip, you got to preach that. But, in a sense, again, church polity wise, they haven't given you permission, so to speak, because they haven't given consent. You know what I'm saying? I think it does. Again, I think that we can. These things are solved on a practical level, but polity, they really need to reflect some of these realities on the ground.
And wrestle with.
Yeah.
I don't think you're drawing a line in the sand. I think
Right.
you're saying these are real issues that if you're going to have assistant pastors, you need to sort through the implications and the biblical, the application of biblical principles.
Right.
This conversation will happen at least on some level in a few months here in Chattanooga.
Mm-hmm.
Overture 10. I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it's a great first stab. I'd love to see what Overtures does with this. So I'd love to see rationale for the 3/4 majority, but I think in principle, I think this is a great first go at this. I think that it gives the congregation some consent. They have some freedom. The thing, if I was on Overtures and I got to add an amendment, I would say that something that Hodge suggests is that perhaps that when the assistant pastor is first called, that the session is given some sort of veto power at the beginning as well. I think that would seem to me like it would be a little more consistent with what I'm seeing in the preliminary principles and historically what's being talked about around the assistant. What'd you say?
To give the congregation some veto over the calling of an assistant.
At the beginning, right? Not just at the end. So I think this would be great if I could insert that. Man, I'd be all for it. But I like the idea of saying 5 years is plenty of time. It's a good amount of time for us to really consider this, and then we need to figure out what's really best for the man and for the congregation. You've probably felt this way too in ministry, but if you don't put reminders about making certain decisions, it just becomes indefinite, and you never really think about it ever again. And so I think that's what I really like about this overture, and I hope that Overtures really considers it and maybe does some wordsmithing, at least in my opinion. But I think in principle, I think it's a good first stab.
Yeah, and I wonder if at the end of 5 years, you either have to call him as an associate. I agree. This is a great first step. Well, as we wrap up and hope that our Wi-Fi holds out for another few, how do you the health of the PCA presently? What encourages you? What concerns you about the Presbyterian Church?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll at least say in my neck of the woods, I've a part of the Carolinas Church Planning Collective, which is men from all 10 presbyteries. We don't have any representative from Southeast Korean, but all 10 presbyteries in North and South Carolina, all coming together to encourage church planning in the Carolinas. So I'm really encouraged about seeing some collegiality, especially we all know that there are a lot of different opinions on how to do ministry and philosophy of ministry. And I'm seeing guys from different sectors of the PCA all come together for the sake of planting churches and spreading the gospel. So I'm really encouraged about that. I'm really encouraged, honestly, over the last couple years, as we've gone through some very difficult controversies. I think we've come out a lot healthier. I have some concerns that some of those controversies are not completely done, or at least they're going to morph into other things.
Yeah.
But I am honestly, to be real with you, I'm glad that General Assembly is boring again, or at least somewhat more boring than it used to be.
We could make General Assembly boring again.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think that there has been some more clarity in terms of there were some kind of philosophy of ministry things that were being thrown around in the mid 2010s that I think have kind of gone, and I'm glad for that. I think that I'm seeing a real resurgence of principled Presbyterians in the PCA. That encourages me greatly. Let's see if we can hold it together under God's grace.
Yes, and be nice about it. We'll see how the General Assembly goes this year. I know we've got a few more overtures to come, a few from Northwest Georgia that are going to be rather spicy, and then one from PD Presbytery that I believe is forthcoming that will hopefully be the badly needed remedy to some of the excesses of the administrative committee, and particularly By Faith magazine. But we'll see how it goes and if those overtures are forthcoming.
Yeah, and I don't really know how the study committees on Christian nationalism, I have no idea how that's going to go. I don't know if that's going to be dead on arrival or if it's going to take over the entire assembly. I have no clue. So,
if we had to have a study paper every time some Baptists do some wrong theology, we'd be. I'm not sure that one's gonna fly, because we could just have a study committee on wrong Baptist ideas and file that.
I'm a little envious of the OPC in that, when we do study reports, and I'm not saying that I have greatly valued from some, like especially the gender and sexuality study report, I've greatly valued. I actually took my congregation through that, at least the shorter version of that report. Yeah, but also, they're doing study reports on republication of the covenant of works under the Mosaic covenant. I'm like, man, I'm kind of envious of those ones. Like, I want those. I also think too, I think, here's a concern of mine. This is probably a good way to put this. I am concerned at times that we can't just say simple stuff. We can't just definitively say something is right or something is wrong. I was talking to one of my ruling elders recently, and I said, could you imagine if we wrote a study report trying to deal with the problems that arose out of Nicaea, right? Can you imagine if Nicaea wrote the Nicene Creed as if it was a PCA study report, right? It would be 40 pages long. It would have, balance on both sides, that sort of thing. And I would just like a simple declarative sentences. I think we need that. I think it'd be really healthy. I think we're afraid of doing that at times.
That's very insightful. Yes. Full clarity is always welcome and always needed in the church.
Yeah.
Well, much for your time and for putting up with this suboptimal. Appreciate your work on this article, which is found on peacequality.org.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ryan.
My pleasure. Thank you to Michael Colvard for joining the program and for putting up with our terrible internet connection this time. Apologies to our listeners. This has been the Westminster Standard Podcast, which is sponsored by Jude 3. For more information on the work of Jude 3 and the PCA, trying to promote confessional fidelity and love for the historic Reformed faith within the Presbyterian Church in America especially, visit our website and help us with a donation or view our extensive research and archives library there, jude3pca.org. Join us again next time. I'll talk to you then.